bad.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo, also known as Ricky Verandas, and a great episode for you today. Today we have an amazing conversation, another amazing guest, Dr. Alan Palmer, and he comes on to talk about his new book, Truth Will Prevail, 1,200 Studies That Refute Vaccine Claims. But we also talk about a lot of other things. He's been a natural bodybuilder and weightlifter. He's worked for a professional hockey team and a professional baseball team as one of their doctors. We talk about diet, health, nutrition, supplements, and much more, many other topics. So I know you're going to enjoy this amazing conversation. And of course, I have to remind you guys, this is a value for value show. If you get some value out of these conversations, please consider giving some value back. It doesn't have to be financial. If you can financially support the show, there's tons of ways of doing so, and I'll let you know how. But if you can't financially support the show, please review, rate the show, tell people about the show, post the show on whatever social media platform you're on, whatever video platform you're on. Just post it to as many places as possible. As you know, once you get kicked off YouTube, you get shadow banned on so many other platforms, and Google just makes it very difficult for new listeners and new people to find your show. So any help is very much appreciated to fight against those algorithms. And if you can't support the show financially, you can support us on Patreon. And no amount is too little to support us on Patreon. So even if you can only afford to support the Ripple Effect Podcast with $1 a month, that's very much appreciated. If a small percentage of the people who download and watch the Ripple Effect Podcast did that and donated as little as $1 a month, I could do the show full time and live pretty good. So hopefully that puts in perspective how little you have to actually contribute to make a huge impact. And if you can support the show financially, other ways of supporting the show is sending a one-time donation via PayPal. We have a Venmo account. We have a crypto wallet if you want to send Ethereum or Bitcoin. We have a merch store with hoodies, t-shirts, mugs, and many other items. So please browse around the merch store and get some awesome stuff. And we have a couple sponsors, one being Content Safe. Content Safe is how I get my videos on all the video platforms I'm on. I upload to one location and then magically they appear on all the video platforms. They also build my website and they help me with a lot of IT stuff. So if you're a content creator, YouTuber, podcaster, anything like that, hit up Content Safe. Let them know you're a listener to Ripple Effect Podcast and they'll hook you up. Another sponsor is the University of Reason, created by Richard Grove, who's also the host of the Grand Theft World podcast. And if you're at a crossroads in life, if you're looking to connect with a liberty, freedom-minded community, check out the University of Reason. It's a great way of expanding on some skills, learning some new skills, helping yourself and helping the Ripple Effect Podcast at the same time. And then the last sponsor is Element Electrolytes. I drink this stuff just about every day. Rarely do I go through a day that I don't use Element Electrolytes to stay hydrated. I'm always working out or working outside or just dehydrated. It's hard to stay hydrated when you're busy. And Element Electrolytes gives you something with no artificial colors or flavors, no sugar, won't kick you out of ketosis, won't kick you out of fasting, will make it easier to stay hydrated, and will also keep you from all those symptoms that are due to dehydration like headaches, muscle fatigue, low energy, and many other things. It tastes awesome. It's simple to use. You just put a packet in your water, shake it up, and just like that, you can optimize your workouts, optimize your body and mind, and use the link in the show description or on my website to support the Ripple Effect Podcast and get a free gift with every purchase. So that's about it, guys. Remember, we have a Telegram group chat if you want to join us there. Like I said before, also remember that if you want to join me for an episode of Ripple Effect Podcast and be on the next Patreon podcast, please support us on Patreon. And I think that's finally it. Enjoy this amazing conversation with Dr. Alan Palmer, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Peace.
And the having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. How
Well,
are we connected? I'm trying to think. Was it James Lyons Weiler? Was it Jack?
yeah, it was Dr. Jack. Yeah, he's done quite a few connections. He hooked me up with Dr. Jessica Rose. He was actually
Oh,
funny because at the time I didn't even know who she was, and she hasn't done it. She didn't do any interviews yet. So when he suggested her, I'm like, yeah, yeah, I'm like, if you're suggesting her, I'm sure she's definitely worth talking to. And I'm like, oh, I'll look into her. And then, time went by, and then finally he's like, hey, are you gonna have her on? I'm like, okay, okay, let's just book her, and then I'll do some research later. And then the day came where I'm just for the show, and I'm like, oh my God, I haven't looked up anything yet. And then I tried doing some research and I couldn't find anything about her. And then the only thing I found out about her, which was actually funny because I'm like, I couldn't find anything COVID related or vaccine related or health related. It was all her surfing and music. And then, which almost made her more interesting. I'm like, oh, she's a surfer? What? And then
yeah.
it was cool because then after I talked to her, she became a regular on the show and end up doing a bunch of interviews. And now she's kind of a household name in the in
She's a brilliant woman, and she has done so much to really kind of uncover a lot of the truth in the data and things like that. Yeah, she's pretty incredible, that's for sure.
yeah. And
Unacceptable Jessica, I think, is her Substack.
yes, yes, it's a
Something
great,
like that.
yeah, great
Yeah.
subject, definitely. And she has a great sense of humor. She's charming. She's fascinating because I think she can come at subjects from so many different perspectives because
Yes.
she is into fitness and surfing and everything.
You look like a musician. I see some guitars in the background. Are those yours?
Yes, yeah, yeah. They're not just yeah, they're not just for decorations. Yeah.
Not props.
No, 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 no. I mean, they look cool. That's why I put them there. I'm
I
like,
like them.
I have them down in the studio. I might as well put them in the camera. But yeah, that's kind of my origin story. Was I was a musician, and then as you get older, it kind of got harder to keep bands together and members invested in
Mm,
projects. So kind of just got stuck doing the 9 to 5 thing for a bit and felt kind of unfulfilled because I wasn't doing anything creative. I didn't feel like I was
mm,
contributing anything to the world. And eventually, I really got into podcasts and with all the commuting I do for work and all the like mindless things that we do, podcasts were perfect because it was kind of food for thought and I could listen to something that was thought provoking while I was driving or cutting the grass or doing whatever chore I had to do. So it kind
mhm.
of gave me that thing I enjoyed from documentaries and researching, but it was something I could do while doing other things. So
Absolutely.
really got into podcasts, and then eventually I'm like, I have microphones, I have software, I know how to do some of this vocal recording stuff. I'm like, why not give it a try and at least worst case scenario, I feel like at least I'm contributing something or doing something creative and doing something with my life. And knock on wood, it started in 2013. I've been very lucky. I mean, just had so many fascinating people on the show, so many bucket list guests. Jesse Ventura's been on.
Oh,
Jim,
I know Jesse.
yeah, Jesse's awesome. Yeah, even though I disagree with him on the COVID stuff, I haven't talked. I haven't talked to him after that whole, since COVID. When I talked to him, it was a while ago. But
Yeah.
John,
He's an interesting character, just to say the least. As an aside, I worked out at his gym in North Minneapolis when I was like 18 years old. And so we'd listen to Jesse sit there and tell us stories and stuff about his days in the Navy SEALs or whatever it was. And he is quite the flamboyant character. As I'm sure you've seen a lot about his background and history and everything. So yeah, interesting guy.
yeah, very interesting. Well, he was an amazing storyteller, and I think when you're a professional wrestler, that's kind of a part of the gig. And,
Hmm.
and I've also had somebody else who's a little bit more current, Mayor Glenn Jacobs, from he used to be known as Kane, the Undertaker's brother in WWE.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. Well, I grew up watching him. Like, that was like my era of wrestling when I was a kid. So it was I was very grateful to have him on. But the cool thing was that I also enjoyed him as a person. He was just has the biggest heart ever. I mean, during the COVID lockdowns, he was one. He obviously the Sanchez and others were getting a lot of credit for what they were doing, and rightfully so. But Glenn Jacobs was doing equally the same amount of pushback, and he was not, falling for the mainstream narrative, and with such a big platform because his WWE career, I mean, he's a Hall of Famer in the WWE and just one of the most well-known characters. And for him to be as outspoken as he has been with all that was just, to me, like it shows how you know how willing he is to tell the truth, even if it means putting other things
Yeah.
on. And Jim Brewer is another one. I had Jim Brewer on, same thing. Like all these guys who are really,
Funny guy.
yeah, they have a very well-known public persona, and to get into politics, or not even just politics, just getting into anything that's somewhat controversial can be career ending. And the
Yes.
fact that they still do it just shows like, their moral compass is much more important than, any financial loss or anything else, pushback that might come with speaking out.
Yep, yep. And just a quick, I'll rattle off a few names here and just see if you recognize them. So from my hometown turned out a lot of big name professional wrestlers. Like, I don't know if you ever heard of the Road Warriors.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Kurt Hennig, who is Mr. Perfect. His dad was Larry the Axe Hennig back in the day. He went to my high school. Ravishing Rick Rude, Nikita Koloff, who was a quote unquote Russian, really wasn't. Went to my high school, and the Berserker and Nord the Barbarian, and gosh, I mean, there's a bunch of them that, and I don't know what was in the water, but it's turned out a lot of the big name wrestlers back in the day.
I was gonna say
So
they're all like pretty household names, like all coming out of the same area. That's pretty.
yeah, some Robbinsdale High School back in Minnesota, and then Henry High School is where the Road Warriors those guys went to, and yeah, yeah, those guys were legends in their day for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome. Wow, that's why. Well, I don't know if you remember Val Venus, but Val
No.
Venus was the guy who, it was funny because so Glenn Jacobs Kane, his story on how he became kind of libertarian minded was because Val Venus and him were talking, and he called him he's like, you sound like a libertarian. And Glenn thought Val Venus was making fun of him, like it was a bad word.
Oh,
He's like, what did you call me? And he's like, no, 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 it means this, and he's like, the philosophy and ideology. And then
yeah,
yeah, you're right. I kind of am, a libertarian. So it was funny how he kind of learned about that whole philosophy and all.
yeah,
And Val Venus was a character that like on on TV on WWE, his persona was kind of like a ladies man, kind of porn
uh-huh.
ish. His name was Val Venus, and
Yeah, right, right.
like, and it was funny because they hear Glenn talk about how this guy was so intellectually sharp and how he was like one of the most influential people in his ideology and molding his worldview. I'm like, Val Venus of all characters. So it's funny how good these guys are at like
Yes.
putting this character on TV. Like you said, in some cases, I think Miro, who was I forget what his name, Rusev, when he was in WWE, like he's another one, and many others who like protect. Oh, and then Yokozuna, right? He was he was related to the Usos and the Rock and that whole family, and yet
Oh, okay.
he was Asian. He was a sumo wrestler, and it's like,
Yeah, yeah.
so
Well,
the
Nikita Koloff, who was his name was Scott Simpson in high school, he actually went so far as legally changing his name, and then he had a fake interpreter travel with him. So he learned some broken Russian. So when they go to a restaurant, he would speak broken Russian to his interpreter and his interpreter. So he never even spoke English in public once he became a Russian. And since then, when he retired from wrestling, he became a missionary and he was building homes in third world countries and everything. So just
wow.
the nicest guy you would ever want to meet. But they, like you said, they have this character that they play, and sometimes they really take it to the extreme.
Oh, that's wild. Yeah. Well, I remember seeing Undertaker during interviews talk about how, back in the day, there wasn't social media, so nobody would ever really see you out of character, so
Mm,
every time you're in a public eye, you always stayed in character. And he's like, and he was saying how it kind of bothers him, but it might be a generational thing where now you see characters on TV, but then you see them under Instagram or Facebook or
yeah,
Twitter or whatever, and they're with their enemies that they're fighting with on TV, or they have a rival with or whatever. And he's like, it kind of ruins some of the mystique. And I get that. Yeah, I can see that. But I feel like with cameras, phones and all this stuff, like people are going to know that's not really you, and they're going to catch you at some point out of character, you know. So it probably is very hard in today's day to keep that up. But yeah, that's so fascinating. It's funny. One thing I love about my podcast is I never know where the conversations are going or where they're going to start.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I never would have guessed this out of this one. I
But
do, by the way, I do have a couple. I think I've got three. Like if we get into a certain conversation about certain things related to the vaccine issue, I've got three slides that I could share, like screen share, if it's something you want to do. If we, get into one is about the measles, the decline of the measles before the measles vaccine, and a little bit about the autism epidemic. So if we get into that, I can kind of show you where it's at currently and where it's projected to go, and those kinds of things. So I've got a couple little things snippets I could share there if you'd like as we're
awesome. Well,
talking.
I just made you a co-host, so you'll be able to screen share if you'd like. And yeah, we can get right into that. I mean, I'll keep all the small talk in because people enjoy the small talk and seeing different sides of people, and not just, the only on one topic, but seeing different
Absolutely.
of who they are and their upbringing. But for people listening who might not be familiar with some of your work, and let's get into a little bit of your own journey, your own personal journey, your own origin story. I think we're always curious on how somebody got to where they are now, and kind of understanding, like, who influenced them, inspirations, different books, documentaries, people that might have opened your eyes to maybe different perspectives. We'll get into all that and more. So start as far back as you would like and include as much as you would like.
Yeah. All right. So professionally, I am a chiropractor, and a little bit of an interesting story is that how I got into that. I got into weightlifting when I was about 18 years old and started doing some powerlifting, real heavy lifting, and I ended up injuring my back pretty severely. Went through the traditional medical route for treatment, and come to find out I had herniated my L5S1 disc. And the doctors I had been going to tried various things and medications and so forth, and I wasn't really getting better. And they started talking about surgery. So at that point, I said I need to try something different. And my mother actually suggested that a friend of hers had gone to somebody who treated the Minnesota Vikings and the North Stars back then, the hockey team back there in Minnesota at the time. And so I was thinking about going into sports medicine of some type. So I thought this is really intriguing if this person's working on athletes. So I'm going to give it a shot. And to make a long story short, he just identified some things with me structurally that none of the other doctors looked at. And he addressed those issues. He got me into orthotics. He got a heel lift into my shoe because I had an anatomical leg length difference that he discovered. He started adjusting me and doing some muscle work, and I got better so fast I was just blown away. So that was my first sort of pivotal moment in my life, and took my career direction towards chiropractic. And so I became a chiropractor, and because of my interest in sports and everything too, I ended up getting in with the San Francisco Giants in spring training, worked with them for about 6, 7 years here in Scottsdale. And then when the Diamondbacks moved here, I started working with them the first year and ended up working with them for about 23 years. I also worked with the Phoenix Coyotes, now the Arizona Coyotes, since their inception here in, I think it was 1986, I believe, their first year here. So I worked with them about 23 years as well. 1996, I believe. Yeah, 1996. So that was a fun journey for me. My original back injury eventually caught up with me, and I ended up just from bending over tables for 25 years and working on patients and everything, and continuing to lift and work out and do sports. I ended up rupturing my L5S1 disc in 2012. So the interesting part about my story is that because I ruptured my disc, it ended up eventually in forcing me to sell my practice because I just couldn't sustain my practice anymore. But that situation is what allowed me to really dig into the issue on vaccines. And without that, if I just had to continue working with two professional teams and a busy practice and everything, I never would have had the time for sure to do that. So I guess, it was a blessing in disguise. Everything happens for a reason, and God had a different plan for me, and I went that direction. So, and just a little bit about vaccines. In my practice, I was very much into functional medicine. health and lifestyle coaching, nutrition, all those different things with my practice and my patients as well. And I would have parents come to me all the time and ask me, well, what do you think about vaccines for my child? Or should I get this vaccine or that vaccine my pediatrician is recommending? And I had a lending library at the time. So I had some books on vaccines, some of the studies on vaccines and research and different things that I had in a binder. And I would give that to them and then say, hey, take this home, read it, study it, take a look at this information, and then ask your child's pediatrician to do the same. Have them give you some information that supports their position and their view, and just look at both sides of the equation and then simply make a decision as to what you think is in the best interest of your child. And so, especially, it's interesting because in today's environment and world where there's so much censorship and everything, I was actually doing what I believe should be still done today, as people should have the ability to think critically for themselves and to look at both sides of an issue and evidence-based science, if they like, on both sides of the equation, and then make up a decision, make up their minds for themselves, make a decision for themselves. So at the point then when I would say probably about 2 years after I had my original injury, I started seeing quite a few posts, different kinds of social media posts and things that were really berating parents who chose not to vaccinate their children. I have 4 grown children now. None of them have ever been vaccinated because I basically looked at the risk versus the reward scenarios with the vaccines, and I chose not to do that. They've all been extremely healthy and very well-balanced, healthy children. But that was my decision. So when I started seeing all these posts, I started writing some rebuttals to some of these social media posts, and funny, but some of them were relatives of mine that were posting some of these things, that were very denigrating to parents who chose not to vaccinate. And then I watched a Jimmy Kimmel episode one night. It was a monologue where he just completely went off on parents who chose not to vaccinate. And he had doctors, or they were actors posing as doctors, I don't know which, in the back of his stage with lights and the backdrops and everything. And they had them being interviewed. And these doctors or posing doctors were saying, well, if I've gone to 8 years of medical school, and if you think you know more than I do about vaccines, you're crazy. And they were dropping F-bombs and all these things, calling parents names. They would bleep them out, of course. And I just looked at that and I said, has it really come to this? Okay, game on. So I said, instead of just responding in a small way, I'm going to really dig into it. And so I started a journey that ended up 2.5 years later, and probably spent about 2,500 hours is what I'm estimating, digging into the science and the studies and the research on PubMed and all the different scientific journals and everything, and really started composing a document. It was a PDF that I just started growing and growing and growing. It was kind of like the proverbial drinking water out of a fire hose. I had so much information coming at me, and I kept adding it to this document, and it ended up becoming an ebook that was 450 pages long and contained over 1,200 studies. I should say excerpts and summaries and snippets from 1,200 studies that contradict or refute the public narrative about the safety and efficacy of vaccines. So I designed this PDF, this ebook, so that it could be really used as a reference tool or research tool for people that were looking for evidence-based information on the subject. The whole table of contents has their links. Everything in the table of contents has links to that story or that subject in the ebook. Everything is linked to the original study and the reference material, which it contains. When I added it up, it was about 45 different scientific and medical disciplines, journals from about 45 different science and medical disciplines that made up the bulk of what I have in that document. So it really became a labor of love. And when we released it, I had an international chiropractic association hosted on their website. So I put it on my website, hosted on their website. And we ended up giving away over 100,000 copies of it. So it was really such a blessing to me to be able to create the most comprehensive expose, if you will, on vaccines that have ever been done, and to be able to release it out there to the world. Since then, I've updated it about a half a dozen times. And it keeps growing and growing. Now it's about 760 pages and has over 1,500 studies in it. And so I'm going to stop talking because I'm just kind of rambling, but that's sort of my journey, I guess, if you will.
No, well, that's all super important, and there's so many things I want you to expand on. I've had, I believe Dr. Jack was a part of this study, when the vax versus unvaxxed study, with the pediatrician office from California. I forget his name. He was but
Dr. Paul Thomas.
Paul
Dr.
Thomas.
Paul
Yep.
Thomas.
Yep. Dr. Paul Thomas was on, and he was very open to vaccinating and not or vaccinating kids, delaying the schedule. If you don't want to vaccinate your kids, he was completely okay with that too. And then he was I'm sure people listening might be familiar with this if people are new to the show and haven't went back and listened to this podcast. I think it was very important because they basically showed that just about in every category and what other way, which of any way you break it down, the more vaccines you had, the more likely you're going to have some type of health issues. And he proved it. And then they end up taking away his license. And I believe he got it back and he's back at it. But I mean, it was one of the most, he had basically, I think, the biggest pediatrician YouTube channel on YouTube. It was ginormous. He had a huge practice, nothing but positive reviews. And then once he was a part of this study, then all of a sudden, he became a bad guy. But and there's something special about chiropractors because it was funny. I was listening to a John Stockton podcast, and he was on a show that's a friend of mine, and he was talking about how when there was a chiropractor that fixed his ankle. And, typically when you're a professional athlete, they tell you like, do the, put it up, ice it, use anti-inflammatories, all this stuff. And he explained what the chiropractor did, but he's like, in no time, he was up on it and he was fine. And he was, and he's like, it completely made him kind of change his perspective on modern medicine. And it seems like that seems to be something about chiropractors that have been in this battle, maybe not even knowing it, for a long time in regards to like changing people's perspective on modern medicine. And I've always been very skeptical of modern medicine because of many reasons like yourself. Like I've always been a gym rat. I go to the gym every morning. I play basketball. I play soccer. I'm constantly, and I know over and over again, there's people that doctors will say, you'll never be able to play sports again. And they do. And there's plenty of doctors who give, health advice. And I've always been in a diet, nutrition, and trying to find ways to optimize your body. And nobody knows better than athletes or people who are gym rats, power lifters, because you are literally trying everything. You're putting into practice the things that you're reading. You're not just reading it and regurgitating. You're literally attempting these things to try to figure out, how do I optimize my body and what works and what doesn't work. So one of the most knowledgeable places, best places to gather knowledge is a gym, because everybody's trying things and everybody's, sharing information. Everybody's trying to figure out what works and doesn't work. And so I love the fact that you come from that perspective. And I think that's also one of the benefits of Dr. Jessica Rose, like her coming from a sports background. But when you talk to doctors, and I've talked to Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, I've had Dr. Thomas Seyfried on, I've had tons of amazing people, like they all tell you the same thing. The amount of time that's spent on diet and nutrition is very little. I mean, they know just about nothing about the topic. And it's all goes back to basically our whole perspective, our modern perspective on health and nutrition. Like we focus on symptoms and managing those symptoms. We don't look at what's causing the issue, right?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you hit on a great point there. Over the COVID pandemic, about 2 months into the pandemic, I started looking at data from different countries and seeing who really was affected by the virus. What was the population that was susceptible? Mostly people over the age of 80 or had 3 to 4 comorbidities or more, different things like that. And then I saw the public health response and how out of perspective it was, or out of proportion to who's really susceptible. They weren't following what became the Great Barrington Declaration, where 3 of the world's top epidemiologists and virologists decided that it'd be better if we just do a focused approach, focus on protecting those that are most vulnerable. But instead we chose a one size fits all. pretty much all the countries did that. Sweden had some really interesting nuances to their approach to the virus, and we could talk about if you want at some point. But I started to do a newsletter, and so last month was my 36th newsletter. So I never thought I would be putting this newsletter out for 3 years. And it's typically now about 150 plus pages every month with full of the data, the science, and everything. But the point I want to make with that is that every month I do a nutrient of the month. And I've covered probably in those 36 issues, because a couple of the nutrients I've covered 2 or 3 times, I'd say probably about 28 or 30 different nutrients that have been shown to be valuable or beneficial in preventing and or treating respiratory conditions, viral conditions, and even COVID-19. And so I put the science and the studies backing that up. But to your point, it's so true. You know, our bodies are self-regulating organisms, you know, self-healing, self-regulating organisms. And if we can give them what they need in the way of proper diet, proper nutrition, supplements when necessary, like supplementing vitamin D to optimal levels if you don't get enough sunshine. Vitamin D, by the way, is one of the most it's I guess I would call it it was sort of a suppressed superhero, if you will, from the nutrition world during the COVID era here. We didn't hear much about the benefits of vitamin D, although was dozens. I have probably 7 or 8 dozen studies on my website that show the benefits of optimizing vitamin D levels with upper respiratory viruses, even far before the coronavirus pandemic, and from studies that show its benefits in preventing and reducing severity and death and hospitalizations with COVID. And so, yeah, if we give our bodies what they really need, and we get exercise, and we get proper rest and stress reduction and healthy water, and keep junk out of our life and our diet, and but I guess one of my biggest frustrations with this whole last 3 years is, our own CDC, which stands for Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC-NP, they never focused anything on prevention. Like, I kept waiting for a public service announcement about vitamin D. I kept waiting for a public service announcement where they would tell people, go out and get some sunshine and some fresh air. Open up your windows in your house and get some cross through ventilation. Take zinc, take quercetin, take some of these other things that can help support your body's immune system, and get good rest and exercise. Don't lock yourself down in your basement. And then the wearing masks thing and all that, which just suppressed oxygen in people and increased carbon dioxide. And it's just, there were so many things that went awry with our response to that pandemic. And, I actually, in one of my newsletters recently, I covered, it was 42 different things that they did and forced on people that proved to be wrong. They got about everything wrong throughout the whole thing with their response to the pandemic. So yeah, I agree with you. My background is as a natural bodybuilder too, and I did that for a few years, and just to see what you can do with your own body with exercise and diet and nutrition, and how you can change your physiology and your body is fun, and it's amazing if people will take care of their bodies. And that's another thing with the United States. We look at the Western countries that are the most affluent countries did the worst with COVID. They have the highest rates of obesity, the highest rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer and other things like that, diabetes. In fact, the United States they were ranked 15th in the world, 15th worst as far as the number of people that died of COVID-19 per million population. It was just under 3,500 people per million population, 15th in the world as far as the worst. So I know we could talk shop. We could talk about that all day long, and I love that subject. But yeah, I think that's one of the missing components to the whole pandemic narrative is the importance of, I call it your terrain. There was a famous debate by Louis Pasteur. He was the father of the germ theory, that we need to kill germs, that promoted antibiotics and things like that. And then There was Antoine Beauchamp who said, it's not the germ, it's the terrain. It's the terrain. It's how you take care of your body. It's what you do in your life with your health and your diet and your water, your water intake, all those other things. It's keeping a healthy terrain that's the most important thing. So there's that age-old debate where allopathic medicine falls more in the camp of Pasteur, and the germ is the preeminent thing that we have to fight against. And then there's Beauchamp, who said, no, people need to take care of their bodies and create a healthy environment, and therefore be far less susceptible to disease.
And that terrain theory is interesting one, and that's why I actually had two past guests that come from two different backgrounds, but I knew would be open minded to talking to each other on. And I had Dr. Tom Cowan on again, and I had Dr. Jessica Rose on again, and I'm like, hey, would you guys be willing to chat? Because I'm too dumb to really know if any of this makes sense. You guys could have a much more intellectual conversation, and even Jessica, who obviously is a virologist and all this stuff, like was very, I shouldn't say convinced, but she was very open-minded and seemed like she was very intrigued with his perspectives on many of these topics. So I find it very fascinating. I think so many things we have to rediscover, because sometimes I say, like, we're trying to reinvent the wheel, and a lot of times our ancestors kind of had it right. And we modern things end up ruining it. When you look at the way we walk, right? Like the Nike shoe with the cushioning ruined our mechanics, and we should be walking on the ball of our feet, and now because of modern sneakers, it's probably caused some issues. You look at like Wim Hof, right? Our breathing, we do shallow breathing now. We don't breathe in deep. I think that's why runner's high is a thing. The all that oxygen. There's also meditation. That's always, it always seems to focus on breathing, many different types of meditation. You look at DDP yoga. Speaking of wrestlers, Diamond Dallas Page came up with his own yoga that was helping athletes who supposedly were never going to walk again and never going to wrestle again, and all this stuff. So, and all these methods, it's really just getting the most out of you. Like, you become the solution. And I know you talked about back pain. I've had well, I didn't have the doctor on, but I had a doctor on that was friends with him, who wrote the book Mind Over Back Pain. And that whole connection between how, like you talked about stress, how stress can actually lead to some physical pain. And you think they're like not connected, that the mind and body aren't connected. But because if it's physical, if you feel the pain physically, you assume it must be a physical problem, and it's not always the case. So there's all these things that I think are really interesting, and a different way of looking at things. The knees over toes guy, which Ben, I forget what his last name is, but a very fascinating guy who became a star athlete. I don't know if you're familiar with the knees over toes guy, but he's incredibly fascinating. This guy was and you being into a gym rat, you appreciate this. He was the worst athlete on his high school team, had horrendous knees, like the awful joints, and then discovered this knees over toes type of training. So, which actually makes perfect, like most things, once you like look into it, you're like, actually makes more sense than what we're doing now. If you're running or jumping, if you slow down your watching the human body, you'll notice that the knees are always over the toes when you jump and when you run. So why would you train flat-footed when you're doing squats or doing leg, any type of leg exercises? Because you're never going to jump like that. You're not recreating the movement that you would use on the soccer field or basketball court or whatnot. So he started training knees over toes, and what, like we've been talking about, the human body is amazing. When you do squats flat-footed, you put a lot of pressure off your knees. Your knees don't hurt. But if you put weights, like I sometimes I'll put weights underneath my heels to lift my legs up, you'll notice that some of the friction goes towards your knees. So you actually put a little pressure on your knees, which ends up strengthening your knees, which makes perfect sense because that's kind of what you're doing with your muscles, right? Like, or your immune system, right? You need to get sick. So it's like if you don't work out your knees a little bit in some way, you can actually weaken them and later have issues because you haven't exercised them. So to make a long story short, now I'm rambling, but people are used to this on my show. But to make a long story short, he went from the worst athlete on his high school team to changing the way he's trained and getting a scholarship to Division I college, and
Wow.
amazing. And then
Yeah.
he shows up, and his strength and conditioning coach says, "Hey, I love your story, but we're not doing any of that knees over toe shit here." And he's like, this is how I got here. This is what I did to get here, and that's how I became a Division I, athlete. And so he ended up making his life's work to teach people how to train correctly, and he does a lot of pushing, sleigh pushing and pulling and that type of stuff because it naturally creates a knees over toes movement. And just done, but it was like a guy who completely threw out everything we've been doing for a while and just making you rethink things. And you think it's a new thing, and then you come to find out, like when you really analyze, you're like, this isn't new. We've ruined something along the way, and now we just have to go back to the way we did things.
Absolutely. And there's always a resistance to change. The status quo is much more comfortable than change. People get used to things the way they are, whether they're the right way to do things or not. And so that's a challenge always, for sure.
Well, why do you think chiropractors specifically always seem to be much more open-minded to these different ways at looking at health and nutrition and the body and all these things?
No, I think it goes back to the philosophy of chiropractic. We believe that our body is run by what we would call innate intelligence, this innate intelligence that tells your heart to beat, every minute, how many times a minute, that tells you to breathe, that controls your blood flow in your body, controls, the nerve impulses, through your body. Everything that happens, you don't have to tell your stomach to digest your food, right? It's just automatic. We have this intelligence within our body. You cut your finger, you might put something on it, like mercurochrome, and way back in the day when we were kids, until we found out there was mercury in it. And you might put, antibiotic cream or whatever, but that's not what heals the cut. Your body heals from the inside out. And so, chiropractors have always recognized that the nervous system, the brain and the nervous system are what control and regulate everything in the body. And so because of the fact that the brain is contained within the skull, and then the spinal cord comes down through the spinal vertebrae, through the spinal column, and those nerves have to exit between those pairs of vertebrae that all have motion and can move in various directions, that if you get some of those bones that become misplaced or displaced out of their normal position, or aren't moving in their normal ranges of motion, they get stuck, that it can create some kind of an interference to the nervous system and influence in a negative way the organs, tissues, and cells that those nerves would go to. And so we've always had this vitalistic view, I guess, of the body, whereas a lot of modern medicine looks at the body almost like a machine. It's more of a mechanistic view. And so this vitalistic view that chiropractors tend to have sort of fuels our philosophy on everything as it relates to taking care of the body. And so I think that's why, we have just a little different perspective on certain things like that. And, interestingly, back to the vaccine topic, I would say, and I don't know what it is today, but I know 20 years ago, probably 95% of chiropractors didn't vaccinate their children. And I've heard interviews by people who go to these. They might go and visit a chiropractic conference or a big seminar that's being held, and they're just struck by they watch the children of chiropractors, at these events, and they're just struck by the great behavior of these kids. And traditionally, when you look at and obviously there's a different lifestyle with chiropractic too. Most chiropractors feed their children very nutritious food. They're not feeding them junk food. They take care of them in other ways, but than just adjusting their spines. But if you look at children of chiropractors, they tend to be much healthier. They rarely have things like ear infections or asthma or ADHD or any of these other things, as compared to a lot of people, a lot of children in this day and age.
Well, I know that firsthand because I have a 8-year-old and a boy and a 6-year-old girl, and neither of them have ever been vaccinated, and they have zero allergies, zero autoimmune issues, zero autistic symptoms, no health issues whatsoever. We only went to go see our pediatrician like once or twice a year to check their height and weight, and of course those were usually unpleasant visits because they're pressuring us into vaccinating our children. And eventually it led with me getting in a little bit of a debate with the pediatrician and getting a letter in the mail saying we weren't welcome back. But I, there wasn't a answer from the pediatrician on why, since the day my child was born, you said they were at risk of dying and getting all of these diseases, and yet 8 years later my son never shows up to your office for any health issues whatsoever, and cognitively he's sharp. One of the smartest kids in his class, one of the best athletes in soccer on his team. He plays for both my kids play for a local like premier club, and like how can you explain how they can be so healthy if, according to what you're saying, they were in danger immediately because I didn't vaccinate them? So it's, I think, I love the fact that you're willing to state that your kids aren't vaccinated, because I feel like that is one of the issues, is that there's a lot more of us out there than we think, but too many of us are afraid to be labeled or I remember my wife, like when we were sending our kids to school, we had medical or religious exemption forms for them not to get vaccinated. And she's like, "Oh, they're going to look at us as the anti-vax family." I'm like, "That's fine, because you know what's going to happen? They're going to meet our beautiful, well-behaved, awesome, healthy kids, and maybe they're going to rethink their judgment on unvaccinated kids, because they're going to be like, wow, these kids are so well-behaved. They're never out because they're sick. The parents seem like great people. These aren't the crazy anti-vax people that, the media tells you they are. So I think that, it does help with like kind of getting rid of that stigma."
Well, and I think, that's a pejorative that people use. It's a slang term designed to, put somebody down. And we've seen that through the whole COVID vaccine issue, with people that chose not to get vaccinated. And I think, the narrative or the pediatricians would lead you to believe that, it's vaccines that have saved us from these childhood diseases, that children aren't dying from measles anymore and so forth because of vaccines. I'd love to do a screen share with you if I can, since we're talking about this. If I could just show you a slide here. Let's show you this one first, and I'll show you another one. But are you able to see that?
Yep.
Yep. So this is from the Vital Statistics of the United States, and it's looking at the incidence of mortality or death from various infectious diseases from 1900 on the left all the way down to 1963 here. And you can see with all of these different infectious diseases, the rates of these infectious diseases drop precipitously over the first 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades of the 20th century or the 1900s. And you can see when the whooping cough vaccine, for example, came into widespread use right here. But yet you can see that the incidence of whooping cough was almost down to zero as far as mortality or deaths from whooping cough. The measles vaccine wasn't introduced until 1963, way over on the right-hand side. And you can see how the measles, once again, the mortality rate had declined 99%, actually 99.4% before the vaccine was even introduced. So it wasn't necessarily the vaccines that have saved people. Now, were some children still dying from measles in 1963? Yes. There was an estimated about 400 cases of death from measles a year in 1963. And but let's talk about why that might be. And to do that, I just want to discuss just a second here about why all these infectious diseases nearly went away and the deaths from them nearly went away. Back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, if you looked at the major cities that most of the populations lived in, obviously some people lived in farming communities, but most of the major cities that housed people, they were like petri dishes. Most of them in the late 1800s still had dirt roads going through them. They had cattle and horses walking up and down the roads, sheep and goats, eliminating everywhere. It was just a mess with germs, and people's diets were not very healthy. They didn't have uh, good nutritious food. The clean water supply was hard to get in these big cities at the time to have healthy water. We didn't have chlorination. We didn't have ways to bring water to people. And a lot of people lived in like tenement houses or these constructed buildings. In my ebook, my 1200 Studies Truth Will Prevail ebook, I've got a great article in there showing some pictures of what conditions were like in some of these cities. They had literally open sewage running behind these apartment buildings and these complexes where people live. They didn't have sanitation. They didn't have sewers. They didn't have flushing toilets. And so disease, because of the condition, again, the terrain was so bad, and people did not have the availability of all the things we do today, that the death rate from a lot of these infectious diseases was very high. And it's still that way in some areas like sub-Saharan Africa or certain parts of maybe in Bangladesh or certain areas where they're almost like slums, kind of like it was back then here. And measles can still be a very deadly disease. So what caused this decline? It was improvement in sanitation, once we got better commerce into the cities and brought in fruits and vegetables and all kinds of things and had better living conditions. Not having the kinds of, putrid filth, everywhere, and better water supplies. And then in the 1950s, they started fortifying foods with certain vitamins. And that, again, brought the infectious disease mortality rates down even further. So as all of those public health improvements and nutritional improvements have gotten better, then that's what caused the decline of all those diseases. So back to where we talked about the measles here in 1963. I've got some studies in my book that show that the children that typically succumb to measles at this time, let's say those about 400 a year in the United States, you were 10 times more likely to die from measles if you came from certain counties, certain municipalities where the poverty rate was extremely high. Once again, those children they were malnourished. They just didn't have good living conditions. And so their terrain was susceptible to measles. I would argue that there have been such advancements made in food, quality of food, water, fortification of food, vitamin access, all these different things, that if we never vaccinated in 1963, I think what we would find today is virtually zero measles deaths at all, if we had never even vaccinated. And vaccines will protect against getting measles, but they also wane. About one of the studies in the journal Vaccine from 2018 showed that the measles vaccine wanes or decreases the antibody levels about 9.7% per year. So if a child gets that vaccine at age 6, within 10 years or so, by the time they're in their late teens, they virtually had zero protection from the measles. And so it's not a lifelong protection like getting the natural infection was. And interestingly, and then I'll stop on this topic here, but I do want to show just one more screen capture here real quick. And this is actually a line of the measles, showing it more isolated here. So from 1900 to 1963, and here's where the vaccine was introduced. So I think that, again, if we look at the terrain, we look at our modern day lifestyle and where we are today, that these infectious diseases, and I was actually going to add to that it's been shown through many studies now that these childhood infectious disease actually had a purpose, that many scientists now believe that they actually can prevent different types of cancer as we get older and things like that. So I know that sounds really bizarre and sort of, how does that work? But, one of the reasons we need to be exposed to germs as children is it trains our immune systems. And so it helps us to become better able to live in an environment where we have viruses and bacteria and all these different microorganisms. We're exposed to them all the time. How the connection with the cancer is still a little bit of a mystery, but it's interesting that some of the studies are showing that connection.
Yeah. So how, and I've seen these graphs and I think they're very important because, like you said, I think one of the arguments that people always make to justify vaccinating your children or getting vaccines in general is they give all the credit to, these diseases not being a issue anymore. It's all due to the vaccines that were introduced. And I always use COVID as now I use it as a perfect example on how that isn't the case and how easily you can make that, or write history in that way, even if it's not true. Because I think we're living in an era where some people, and I hear people still repeat it, that thanks to the vaccine, we're over COVID. We've moved on, and they're giving all the credit to getting our lives back to the vaccine, when the truth was, like, the majority and they're ignoring the fact that all the increase of just all mortality, deaths, and going up now, and all this stuff, and all the health issues that are going up now. But you can see how people can just say, hey, yeah, the COVID vaccine got us out of this, and people just repeat that. It doesn't have to be true. There's no real research or data proving it. And so living through it, you can kind of see how they could do that in the past too. And but how did we get here? Like, with the fact that these vaccines weren't really preventing or curing, and there's also health issues with some vaccines and adverse reactions. Like, why did we get to a point where now they just keep adding and adding and adding vaccines? Do you think at any point the vaccine makers really believed in the vaccine science, or was it always just a incredibly profitable a product that they wanted to push to the public?
Well, I think, you've heard the saying, money is what makes the world go around. It's so profitable. And so I think that it is all about the money. It really is. But the thing is that I think there's a lot of well-intentioned doctors out there, including pediatricians, that have really been sold a bill of goods. They've really been convinced that vaccines are what have saved us from all of these, quote unquote, dangerous diseases, right? But there was Hitler had a propaganda minister. His propaganda minister, his name was Joseph Goebbels, and I just love this quote because this last 3 years is a perfect example of how this man's philosophy was used against people of the world. And what he said was that a lie told once is a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes the truth. And so that's how the Nazis convinced the German people that the Jews were filthy and they needed to be, eliminated, etc., because they were told so many times that that was the case. I mean, they were lied to so many times that it became true to people. And if you think about the fear porn that has gone on since, February of 2020, especially the first year and a half or so, oh my goodness, not only does fear suppress the immune system, just think how much worse that made the pandemic for so many people. People were so scared, and that creates an extreme amount of suppression to the body's immune system and immune response. But it also, the hearing the same thing over and over and over, repeated ad nauseum, just convinced people that it was true and that the vaccines were going to save us. And so, people were so convinced by that they really bought into the fact that even though the vaccines were never studied to see if they would prevent infection or transmission, in fact, they knew early on, and there's a very revealing video of a woman, an executive from Pfizer in the European Parliament, admitting that we had to do it by the speed of science. We didn't have time to check and see if it would stop transmission, something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing, but they knew early on. Everybody knew, the CDC knew, the FDA knew that they didn't stop transmission, but it was sold to people that way. Can you remember all the officials, all the way up to the president, saying, if you get your vaccine, you can go see grandma, you can resume your life, you're going to protect your community, do your part, right? It was all a big lie, and they knew it. It was all a big lie. So I think what this has done, because the narrative that we've seen surrounding the COVID vaccines, it's the same playbook that they've used for the last 3, 4 decades about the childhood vaccines. Same playbook, but on steroids. Um, the clinical trials in the childhood vaccines they're a sham. They're a sham. And what most people don't realize is how poorly designed those clinical trials were. Like, for instance, the two different types of hepatitis B. And hepatitis B is a vaccine that's given to children at birth, day one in the hospital, their first injection. One of the brands was only the children were studied for 4 days after the shot, and the other one for 5 days. They weren't looked at long term. So it's that way with virtually all of the childhood vaccines. The other thing they do is when you study a drug, or in this case, a vaccine, you're supposed to use an inert substance as a placebo. Inert substance is something that, if it's injected into the body, won't have any reaction in the body. And usually they use saline solution, which is isotonic, the same pH and everything as body fluid. But what they've done, there's never been a saline placebo in any of the childhood vaccine safety trials. They'll either use another vaccine, or they'll use, many of the vaccines contain aluminum. They'll use an injection, a serum containing the same or more aluminum in the placebo that they used in the vaccine subjects that were vaccinated. Why would they do that? Because they're trying to mask the difference in side effects or adverse events or effects from the vaccine. If they're not giving an inert substance, they're giving something very similar to what the vaccinated children get. There's going to be less of a contrast between the health of the children on either side. So those are just a couple of many, many examples of how those vaccine trials have been just manipulated and very, very poorly done. So I think back to what I was saying is doctors, they don't know all that. I'll bet doctors have no idea what the ingredients are in many of the vaccines. And aluminum, for example, is a neurotoxin, a very, very potent neurotoxin. And the babies at birth get 250 micrograms of aluminum into their brain. And then in the first 6 months, they get 2 more doses. So that's 750 micrograms in the first 6 months. In total, in 18 months, the first 18 months of life, children will get 5,820 micrograms of aluminum injected into their bodies. And why is that bad? Well, it's bad in part because babies, infants, and young children have what's called an immature blood-brain barrier. So the blood supply to the brain, the things that can be absorbed into the brain from the blood supply to the brain, or get through that porous wall, those little pores, they're called gap junctions. Think of them like the little gaps between my fingers here. They're very wide open until a child is about 2 or 3 years old. And over time, these gap junctions tighten, which reduces the ability of nanoparticles and these small little particles to get into the brain. So once the blood-brain barrier matures, the brain is much more protected. Yet in the first 18 months, the amount of aluminum that's injected into babies is just massive. And the ironic thing, and then I'll leave it go at this, but the ironic thing is that the FDA has limits on the amount of aluminum that a baby can have by IV nutrition. So sometimes when a premature baby or a baby is in the hospital and they're not doing well, they'll give them IV nutrition. One of the byproducts of IV nutrition or contaminants with the manufacturing process is a little bit of aluminum. So they have limited the amount of aluminum that those babies can get in a 24-hour period to 25 micrograms in parental nutrition. Yet, what I say, the hepatitis B has 250 milligrams injected straight into the bloodstream on day one. And then when children are 6 months to a year, they get a multi-dose vaccine that has 750 milligrams of aluminum in one dose. So if the FDA is regulating IV nutrition, why do they let this go? Why do they think this is okay if that's not okay? And so it just doesn't make any sense. But I think that they've held on to the narrative and they defended vaccines for so long that they could never admit, there's no going back. They could never admit that they were wrong about any of this, or that they may have contributed to the demise or to neurodegenerative diseases like autism or things like that in children, because can you imagine the can of worms that would open up? So they will defend that to the very end.
But I think if there's any positive thing that came out of COVID, and I've said this over and over again, is that it has made people much more open-minded to vaccines being harmful, or at least not as safe and effective as we've been sold. Because a lot of people who, the topic would come up and would argue with me or get emotional, and very similar to their pediatricians and their doctors, they would just be regurgitating what Big Pharma wanted them to regurgitate and really didn't do their own research or know much about the topic. They're much more open-minded now. I think I've heard, I think it was one of the Weinstein brothers on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the COVID vaccine, and how he said on the Joe Rogan podcast, he's like, in uncovering all this fuckery, for lack of a better term, with the COVID scenario and the COVID vaccine, he's like, it's made me rethink every vaccine. And,
Yeah.
and it was like a eureka moment. I'm like, yes, exactly. This wasn't a new playbook. This is just the same playbook being, used over and over again.
Well, yeah, and they've just overplayed their hands so badly with the COVID vaccines, and people have seen how, I mean, if you look at the CDC's own early warning system or tracking system called the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, there have been 35,000 deaths reported to that from the COVID vaccine. There have been 1.6 million adverse reactions to the COVID vaccine. We have heard some things about the myocarditis and the rates of myocarditis, especially in certain age groups of males more than females. But there are so many other kinds of ill effects and adverse effects are being reported through the VAERS system that, but we don't hear a thing about it. Nobody talks about it. The government completely ignores it. This is their own early warning system. They designed the system so they could tell if there was a problem with a certain product, a certain vaccine. And in the first 6 months or so of the COVID vaccine rollout, there had been more deaths reported in that system than all the vaccines for 30 years combined had been reported. So, but they're just turning a blind eye to it. And the people that are vaccine injured that are finding no help from anybody. They're not even being acknowledged. They're not even being followed up with. They're not even being supported in any way by our government or anything. So I think all of those things, and as people become more aware of those things that are happening, it is exposing it's kind of exposing the wizard behind the curtain, kind of like Toto did in The Wizard of Oz, right? It's pulling the curtain back, and people are realizing, and when we have FDA commissioners like Scott Gottlieb, who leaves the FDA and then gets a very lucrative job on the board of Pfizer, and then he's not the only one. There have been several examples of that. It's like a revolving door between our federal health agencies and big pharma. And I saw a great meme the other day because Dr. Rochelle Walensky just stepped down as a CDC director. I think she's done in June. But it just shows all these different people that got these lucrative jobs in pharma after being, heads of the FDA or the CDC. And then it just shows a question mark, like, where's she going? It's like to the highest bidder, probably. And, the sad thing is, even like with Scott Gottlieb, he was out there pimping the vaccine for Pfizer as the former FDA commissioner. Now he's somebody who is supposed to, he's supposed to be trusted with the public trust, I guess is what I'm trying to say, entrusted with the public trust. And so he's supposed to be a trustworthy figure, yet he's promoting the company he works for as the former FDA commissioner. So this is the kind of stuff that these things have been going on for decades. And now, to your point, if people are really waking up and starting to question, and hopefully people will be able to use resources like my 1200 Studies Truth Will Prevail to really dig in to the evidence and the science behind what has been going on and behind what is really inaccurate or misrepresented with regard to the safety and efficacy of vaccines, not just childhood vaccines, but the flu vaccine and many others.
Yeah, and I've had Dr. Wakefield on to promote his documentary, The Act 1986, and I believe you can find it on many of the video platforms, Rumble, Odyssey, stuff like that. But it's a amazing documentary because it goes into the whole history of vaccine science and all the sketchiness and everything that's involved in it, because like much of history, it's written by the winners, and there's agendas and reasons why you're getting, a certain perspective on that history. And so he does a really good job of highlighting the history of it and getting people to understand. I mean, there's many people who don't even know there's a vaccine court. A lot of people don't know that they're not liable for any adverse reactions and all this other stuff. So but it's amazing how many people will defend it. And I've used this metaphor before in the past, like the if you gave everybody peanut butter, there's going to be some deaths. There's some people, if you mandate one thing for everyone, there's going to be some adverse reactions. There's going to be some possible even deaths. And yet vaccines must be the safest thing on earth, because vaccines are apparently more safe than peanut butter, because you can give everybody the exact same vaccine. And then when you talk about adverse reactions or deaths, people look at you like you're crazy.
Yes, yeah, that's so true. And you're referring to the act is the 1986 Act, which absolved pharmaceutical companies or vaccine manufacturers of any responsibility or liability due to injuries or death. And the reason that came about actually was because of the DPT vaccine. The DPT vaccine was causing so many injuries and deaths to children that the manufacturers were being overwhelmed by lawsuits, and they were in danger of going out of business because they were having to pay out more in these lawsuits because they were losing. That they said to the government, if you want to keep vaccines, you have to give us immunity from liability. And so that's how that happened. It happened because so many people were being injured from vaccines. And to date, almost I believe the number is about $4.6 billion have been paid out through that vaccine injury compensation program to date. So, if they were as safe as 1 in a million injuries, whatever they say, the numbers they like to throw out, right? You wouldn't be seeing these kinds of awards. And it's very difficult to get recovery in this system. The system is it's not on the side of the injured. It's more on the government side. Because it's not like a typical court where you can get discovery and you make your case in front of a jury. There is basically a taskmaster, a person that presides over the court who makes these decisions, and the opposing attorneys are from the Justice Department. And so, it's very hard to prove, yet $4.5 billion have been paid out. But I think, one of the things that really underscores this whole issue to me is the rise and the meteoric rise of autism in our country. And I'd love to share a screen share with the viewers here, one more screen share, because this is something that we've got to come to grips with, and we really have to do it quickly. The CDC every 2 years, they have monitoring positions in different states. So they have this network of monitoring organizations that look at the data in that particular state and the rates of autism. And the most recent just came out for 2020. So if you look at this chart here, on the left-hand side here is the number of children with autism per 1,000 children. So that's this vertical graph here, the y-axis. And in the year 2000, it was estimated that 1 in 150 children had autism. Now, 3 decades ago, that was estimated to be 1 in 10,000. So that's a huge leap just to the year 2000. So 3 decades before that. So 1 in 150. And then if you look at the CDC numbers, once again, by 2020, and this is the number that just came out, it's estimated that 1 in 36 children have autism or on the spectrum. And in fact, in California is the highest rate in the United States. It's currently 1 in 22 children with autism. And so what I did is I took the last 15 years and averaged the amount of rise in the rate of autism over those 15-year periods, and I projected that annual rise out to 2032. And if it continues at the current rate, it'll be 1 child in 18 with autism. And boys are about 4 times more susceptible. So the incidence in boys is about 4 times what it is in girls. So can you imagine, it's going to be like 1 in 5 boys, 1 in 4 boys. It's hard to even imagine what things will be like then. And many of these children are never able to engage in normal society. They aren't going to become our scientists. They aren't going to become our firefighters or police officers or join our military. Many of them are going to be either happen to be taken care of by their parents or eventually become wards of the state. We have a crisis in our country. This is a crisis of unbelievable proportions, but it's being swept under the rug. I mean, let's put it this way. If it wasn't vaccines that was causing this autism epidemic, and I don't necessarily believe there's one cause of everything. I think there's other environmental factors that are playing into this. I don't think there's a one cause of anything. I think there could be numerous causes. But when you've gone from just a dozen vaccines and over a dozen doses to 72 doses by age 18 now, and then now they've added the COVID vaccine to the childhood vaccine schedule. So if they get that one time a year or two doses per year, however they decide to do that, by the time they're 18, they're going to be somewhere around 92 doses to maybe 112 doses, depending if they get two doses a year of the COVID. It's just too many vaccines and so many of the ingredients that are affecting children. But let's just say that, you know, why aren't they investigating this? Why isn't this making front page news? If this is a crisis that is so unbelievably important to get a handle on, to me, that just speaks volumes that they are afraid of what they're going to find. Because if it were anything else, if it was something in the food, wouldn't you think we'd be having huge, amount of resources from the CDC directed to that to figure out what's causing this? The fact that they're doing nothing to figure out what's causing this, to me, like I said, it just speaks volumes. That they must be afraid of what they're going to find is the only thing I can figure out. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, that's exactly it. I think they are afraid of what they'll find. And, I think ICANN and Del Bigtree has done amazing work. And Del's been on a few times, and I'm sure you're very familiar with him.
Very
And
familiar, yeah.
yeah, and it just, they don't want to actually have a honest discussion about this. Like you said, it'd be a house of cards that would collapse. I mean, they've sold us on this vaccine idea for so long, and they've done such a great job on it. Because think about it, like, you could talk about big pharma in regards to any other drug or symptom or disease, and everybody would be like, yeah, they're corrupt, yeah, they're bad guys. And then you talk about vaccines, and all of a sudden people would be like, no, but they're safe and effective. It's like, well, you do realize the same person, the same company that lied about that product could lie about this product, right? And the same lack of a moral compass they had when selling you that product, it's the same people with this product. So it's like there was this disconnect. And I think when you were giving vaccines to little kids and babies and newborns, and people just had a hard time grasping, and still many people have a hard time grasping this idea that a pharmaceutical company or doctors or whoever you want to put in this conversation that could be a part of this issue would knowingly do it. And even though they know that they could potentially be harming innocent little babies. And this kind of goes back to what something I kept saying during the whole COVID thing. I would have Dr. Peter McCullough on. I would have, all these people on who seem to be like spiritual people, or religious people. And I'm like, there's a level of evil that the average person cannot comprehend exists. And to me, like, that was the part that people struggled to grasp. Like, wait, you're trying to tell me that people are knowingly putting out a product that harms people? I'm like, do you not know Vietnam happened, right? And a lot of people died. A lot of people were exposed to Agent Orange. A lot of people had trauma and lost loved ones. And did the politicians really care? No, they didn't. So why would you think that, like, this type of evil doesn't exist? I mean, historically, there's always been rulers and empires and monarchies and people who have done harm to others, So all of a sudden we live in this illusion that we think those type of people don't exist, that people care about, that everybody cares about the normal average person. And it's not true. And that's why I think during the COVID lockdown, it seemed like the people who really understood how dangerous the situation we were in was spiritual people and religious people, because they believed in evil. They believed it did exist.
Yes, yes. And if you listen to Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talk about it, the vaccine manufacturers make X number of $1 billion a year, and that's just gone up exponentially, right? But the amount of money they make on the conditions that vaccines cause or very likely contribute to is 10 times that annually, what their vaccine revenue is. So EpiPens and allergy drugs and all these different things that Dr. Paul Thomas and Dr. James Lyon Zweiler revealed in their very important and great study. They make so much money on the byproducts of the adverse reactions to vaccines that it's a huge, and that's not just vaccine manufacturers. That's all the drug companies because they're all selling these kinds of things. And chronic illness in children has gone up from 1989 to where it was 12% of children had a chronic illness or disease to, well, the latest was about 3-4 years ago that I've seen the statistic on this, but it was 54%. So it's gone from 12% to 54%. And so there's something happening to our children. They're just not healthy anymore. And once again, we need to figure out what it is. So yeah, it's a very, very complicated topic. And as well as I do, the pharmaceutical industry has their tentacles into everything, from medical education to the medical journals, to the professional associations, to the media. I love the montages of the videos now showing that sponsored by Pfizer, this show sponsored by Pfizer, they sponsor everything. And that's one of the reasons I think the mainstream media goes along with the narrative, because this is their cash cow. The pharmaceutical industry is their cash cow and they can't speak out against it. So it's when you talk about evil like that you're not willing to tell the truth, you're not willing to really do the hard investigative reporting and speak about what you find and speak about anything but the narrative that you're told to talk about, that's evil in and of itself. And of course, then the politicians too, the same thing with, the pharmaceutical industry just has so much influence over politicians. And so it's, one of my real, I guess, heroes of this whole COVID thing has been Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, who has done some of these COVID-19 hearings, where he's had some of these amazing people on and interviewed them, like Dr. Pierre Corey and Paul Merrick and Jessica Rose, so many different people that he's had in these hearings, where he's really done his very best to try to reveal what's happened with these vaccines and the injuries that they're causing. And in fact, he's invited all the heads of these public health agencies to show up or send representatives, and they never will. They don't. They never even show up to these hearings. So, it's very disappointing.
And people should watch those hearings. They will pull at your heartstrings to see these families who, obviously, most of them were pro-vaccine because that's why they vaccinate children or vaccinate themselves, and to have to live with these outcomes with you having a beautiful, healthy child that was a great athlete and had this beautiful life ahead of them, and then being ruined by this BS propaganda. And being lied to, because the one thing I always say, it's like, if you have all the evidence and you have all the sides of the argument, you have all the every side of the argument, every perspective, opinion, and you can kind of filter out what makes sense to you and what doesn't, and you can weigh out the risk reward thing. Then if you decide to still vaccinate your kids, that's fine. But what really bothers me is the fact that people are making their decisions based on one side of the argument. They're not hearing the other side of the argument. And then, I've had parents reach out to me. They're like, oh my God, I've vaccinated my children. And now after listening to a couple of your podcasts, I'm rethinking it. And I'm like, don't feel guilty about what you've done. I'm like, you're only as good as the information you have access to. You should be upset, not with yourself, but be upset with the people who have suppressed this information from you. I mean, I love the fact that Robert Kennedy Jr. is running. I love the fact that he doesn't stray away from the vaccine topic. If people bring it up, he's willing to discuss it. To me, it's helping make the conversation more mainstream. And because he has obviously such a respected name and history, he's somebody who can represent the movement well. And so I love the fact that he's running, and I love how even though for a long time the media has been trying to label him as an anti-vaxxer, people seem to, not really be tricked anymore by that label. And uh, when you hear him out, he makes sense. He was on Breaking Points recently, and that interview was just it was so ridiculous because it's like they wouldn't let him defend himself, and they just kept, saying that, oh, well, that's, basically just saying what they've been saying forever. Oh, the science is settled, and we all know that it doesn't cause autism, and we know, it's like, no, we don't know that. And when you look at these graphs and you see that basically, like, if you created a graph with how many vaccines we're giving to our children, like that also continuously goes up. So if
Yes.
all these autistic symptoms and all these neurological issues are going up at the same rate or a similar rate as vaccines to our children, then why wouldn't we look at, like, is there a correlation? Is there something connected here? Where's the evidence that the vaccines are helping our children's health? That it's decreasing anything. Like, show me that you keep introducing new vaccines every year to the schedule. Like, show me that it's doing some positive, it's having some positive effect on the human species and on children and on any type of disease or whatever. There's none of that. And so to me, it's frustrating. It breaks my heart knowing how many people, even in our movement, the health freedom movement, who are looking at things from our perspective, how many of them are victims of this propaganda. I mean, Brian from We the Patriots USA, he's an attorney, and they're a nonprofit organization that's big into this movement. He helps people with religious exemptions and people who've been harmed by vaccines. He has a vaccine-injured child. And, Dr. Brian Hooker, who's been on the show, who was a part of the CDC whistleblower story, vaccine-injured child. Like, you look at so many people in the movement, they have been victims to this propaganda. And, to have to wonder, and not to say that there's not kids who can get autism or neurological issues other ways, because I think there are other ways that it can be caused, by exposure to, God knows what or whatever it may be. But to think that, you always have that what if in the back of your mind, that, like, could I have had prevented some of these health issues for my child if I just didn't vaccinate them, and it just, I couldn't even imagine living with that, and that's why when people would say things like, oh, they're blaming the vaccine, it wasn't the vaccine, it's like, I'm pretty sure most parents would want that to be a last resort, to think that, when doctors say, oh, they were born like this, they didn't just pick up on it. What parent wouldn't want to believe that they didn't have a hand in this outcome? Like, that's the majority of parents. Like, to come to the conclusion that it was vaccine related, I mean, that's one of the hardest conclusions you could ever come up to. So, like, that's not something you're just jumping to. So, yeah, and I want to, I'm sure you want to expand on some of that, and I will. But before we run out of time, I also want to, because we keep talking about obviously what's harmful to kids in the human race. And you, as a somebody who also likes to stay fit and always been in this health and nutrition world, I'd love to get some of your things that you prioritize in your life in regards to keeping yourself and your kids as healthy as possible.
Yeah, well, great question. Well, I mean, for our children, especially, and myself, I mean, we it's not that we never have anything that's like ice cream or anything. I wasn't a food Nazi with my kids necessarily, but we'd have treat night one night. But we wouldn't have things in the house, and we don't have snack foods and processed foods and things like that available to them whenever they want, cookies and chips and all that. We would let them have the snacks after their sporting event, after their soccer game and everything, but I would say it was like the 90-10 rule, right? I mean, we were feeding them extremely healthy, organic food. They had to eat their fruits and vegetables. I hear parents say, "Oh, my kid won't eat any kind of vegetables, so I just give them chicken nuggets," right? That's like, wait a minute, who's the parent here, right? So our kids, that they wanted to eat, they ate what they were served, right? And they, that's just the way it should be. I mean, parents should take control of what they feed their children and so forth. So I think it comes down to, I would make a health drink every morning, so it was like a good tasting, actually, greens drink, and I would put some fish oil in it, and I would put some probiotics and all these things. So I'd actually make up a little concoction for them before they go to school. They'd have to take their little vitamins and drink their drink. And, our kids stayed very active. And I think, staying physically active is really important. Too many kids now are sitting on the couch with that video controller, right? So I think that was a huge part of it. Just they were always lean and fit, and all four of them. One played Division I softball. They all played very high level sports all through high school and everything. And so I think that it's just, again, I get them, I adjust them as a chiropractor. I don't want to forget that, because I think that's very important, is getting their spines adjusted and maintained, and exercise, diet, clean water, plenty of good hydration, staying away from the junk and the sugar and all those other things that suppress the immune system and affect their nervous system. And so, yeah, it's just, living that lifestyle. It's like, we call it the chiropractic lifestyle, I guess, for most chiropractors, that's the way we live, and the way we raise our kids is very important.
How about for yourself? Like, is there obviously, if you're exercising, there's plenty of supplements out there, creatine, pre-workouts, nitric oxide, which I think nitric oxide has a lot of benefits. But what things do you take, or would you recommend not taking, or do taking? Is there any vitamins you take for either, joint pain, or just to keep your joints strong? Anything whatsoever that you take on a somewhat regular basis?
Right. Yeah. So the list is long. But I in the morning I'll make a health drink. So I don't drink dairy, so I'll use a nut alternative. I'll put some pomegranate juice in there. I've got a blend of it's like 8 different mushrooms, like lion's mane and maitake and shiitake and chaga, and I put a little scoop of that in there. I put in a little scoop of organic ginger root, organic turmeric. I put in some beetroot in that drink. In the mornings I put in some collagen, and I'll alternate either between whey protein or plant-based protein every morning in that little drink. I don't drink coffee. I just never have been a caffeine guy or a coffee guy. I just get up and go, in the morning. And so and then I put some glutamine in there. And I'll put a little bit of quercetin, and some selenium, a little bit of zinc, and I'll mix up this drink. There's a couple other little items I'll put in there too, but just a real healthy drink I'll have in the morning. And I just try to eat mainly lean sources of protein. I do eat meat, so I'm a big fish guy, especially the cold water fish that are high in the omega-3s, like salmon, cod, halibut, those kinds of fish. I do take fish oil every day. I think that's one of the most important things. It's helped me a lot with my back pain, my inflammation, and so forth, is mitigating the inflammation with higher dose fish oil and curcumin. And yeah, so I mean, I just do all those things. Magnesium. I optimize my vitamin D level. I get my vitamin D levels tested probably 3 times a year to make sure I'm in that 50 to 70 or 60 to 80 range, somewhere around 70 nanograms per deciliter. And so I think those are some of I think the high points are the majority of the things that I try to do. I'll make a decaf green tea every morning. I'll put some Manuka honey in, a little bit of Manuka honey, and I'll alternate some berries. I'll do blueberries one day, raspberries one day. I'll do dark cherries one day, and my hot tea, and just kind of melt them up and have that as my first little go-to, along with my health shake in the morning. And so I have a pretty good regimen of staying healthy. Lots of fresh vegetables. I try to avoid gluten, more of just a choice. I'm just concerned about the levels of glyphosate in our wheat supply, especially. Glyphosate is one of those things that actually Stephanie Seneff from MIT has actually implicated as one of the cofactors, possibly in the autism, rise in autism too, is the high levels of glyphosate and some of the ways that affects the body too. So I think, as I mentioned, there could be several things going on, and I think it's one of the things that I try to eliminate or avoid in my diet as well.
Yeah, she's been on the show, and I think a lot of times when we think about health, we think about like internal things, and we don't really think about external things that we're exposed to, and things that we're breathing, and that type of stuff. So and stuff we're putting on our skin, cosmetic stuff, all that type of stuff, it can all contribute, right? So yeah, without a doubt. And in regards to do you take any vitamins? I know like Tanga Ali and some of the other like herbs for like natural testosterone boost, or cordyceps mushroom is great for energy. like you were saying, mushrooms. The cordyceps mushroom. I've taken a couple of cordyceps mushroom supplements. They're supposed to be amazing for endurance. And I'm like, wow, this is really good, and it works. I can run more, and I have all this endurance, and it's just from a mushroom. Like it's not like some supplement with all this caffeine and nitric oxide. It's just a cordyceps mushroom. So it's pretty amazing that the benefits you can get just from, like you said,
Yeah.
natural stuff, herbs.
Yeah, I've been able to maintain really, really healthy testosterone levels, especially for my age, healthy for men much younger than me, actually. And I take a little bit of boron about every other day, like 5 milligrams of boron. And again, optimizing vitamin D is important for that as well. And then I do high intensity interval training, HIIT training. So I'll do my cardio 3 days a week on a stationary bike, and I'll do a really good HIIT training workout. And that's kind of the way I lift with my resistance training too, is sort of a high intensity interval type intensity to my weightlifting. And so between the resistance training and the high intensity interval training and the vitamin D and a little bit of boron, I think those are some of the main factors. Obviously, keeping a leaner body weight is important, because if men become too heavy, if they have too much body fat, then there's an enzyme called aromatase that will convert part of their testosterone into estrogen. And so being overweight will sabotage your levels of testosterone too. So it's important not to be heavy. And then, of course, you mentioned, personal care products, things like that. I mean, there are so many personal care products that have endocrine disrupting chemicals in them, and in drinking water out of plastic water bottles, the BPH and the BPA and BPS that are in some of these soft plastics also can sabotage endocrine and hormonal levels and so forth too. So I think, the overall healthy lifestyle helps with that as well.
Now, you used to be in body or weightlifting, powerlifting. So, like, obviously, protein shakes and a
Uh-huh.
lot of these things were a big part of that. May, well, when I was growing up, yeah, pre-workouts were kind of getting popular. They weren't quite as popular as they are now. Um, is there any of that stuff you still take now? Like, do you still
Mhm.
take creatine and stuff like that?
Yeah, I do about 5 grams of creatine before my workouts, and I'll mix that in with a little bit of beetroot extract and a little bit of a hydration formula that I have, electrolyte formula before workouts. And then post workout, I'll take like a whey protein drink with some carbohydrates in it to kind of help spike my insulin level a little bit right after my workout, and branched chain aminos in that as well, a little bit of collagen. Sometimes I'll put some of the greens powder in there too, just to alkalinize my system and so forth as well. So, trying to boost that nitric oxide with the beetroot powder a little bit, like you mentioned, the nitric oxide is one of the reasons I will use that. So that's sort of my formula. I try to do that and do that post recovery shake right after I work out within that 1 hour window at least, usually sooner than later.
Creatine is one of the few things that have been, studied really well and have proven that it works. Because in the supplement industry, and I've had quite a few people on the show from supplement industry, and they'll tell you there's a lot of BS in the supplement industry. So when you can, get the actual ingredients, like you said, beetroots for nitric oxide and that type of stuff, or just basic creatine, it's probably your best bet instead of getting these complex products that just have all these fancy labels and whatnot, and then you're not getting any of the stuff that they say you're getting. So and like you're saying, another thing people don't realize, and you mentioned it, is how you can increase your natural testosterone just by lifting heavy, keeping your staying lighter and lean, and getting enough sleep, diet.
Yes.
People are always looking for the easy way out, like give me the pill, like they don't want to
Mhm.
put in this extra work. But a lot of the stuff you can kind of just spark naturally if you're just doing the right things. Yeah.
Amen to that.
Yeah. Well, hey, I've taken up a lot of your time, Dr. Alan Palmer, and thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me and sharing so much of your knowledge and wisdom and your journey and your story. And let people know where they can keep up with your work, what social
Yeah.
media platforms you might be on, where they can get your ebooks or any of the stuff, projects that you're part of. And I'll put all these links in the show description.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd love to do that. Thank you. So my website is wellnessdoc.com, wellnessdoc.com. And at the top of the homepage, you'll see a tab that's titled Educational Portal. And if you hover over that, a menu will come down. It'll have the links to all my different projects that I've been working on. And I don't do a lot of social media right now, and it's probably because I've been so hyper focused on doing this newsletter every month that it takes such a massive amount of time to create this newsletter and get it out every month that I don't have the time to really manage social media. But that's the best way to find me. Also, another link to my 1200 Studies book, which you can find the way I just described, is 1200studies.com. It takes you to, yeah, there we go. It takes you to that educational portal and that particular page for my 1200 Studies. There it is. Oh, good job. Thank you. Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll put all that stuff in the show description. So please check out the books, check out all his work. I'll definitely be keeping up with yourself and hopefully have you on again in the near future. And I'll send you links to the show when it's up and live.
That was great. Love to do it. And thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, thanks, Doctor.
Sure.
Enjoy the
All
rest of
right.
the day. Take care.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.